for our final session. So in the program, this session was actually put down as a session on actionable recommendations. I think this really came out of, I think, the realization that a lot of the recommendations, or at least that we had developed within the synthesis report, were based on particular projects, which we've established at this point did not kind of begin with intersectionality as their entry point. So it was kind of a retrospective analysis of how this concept is aligning with the work that we do. And so the interest then here was to try and resolve some of the gaps within that and try to actually think about more practical recommendations given our diverse contexts, but also with the challenges that have been raised also in the previous session. And I thought that maybe one way of thinking about this, we've had many discussions around the use of language, whether we want to call our work intersectional or not, what the opportunities of this might be in terms of trying to place our challenges and the work that we're doing within a global conversation on development issues and what that might mean for our research. And so then I think as a probe to those in the room and those who are still online, the question then, we've kind of approached this based on how it's been conceptualized, yes, from the global north, bearing in mind that there are particular histories of intersectionality from the global south and ways that we've been doing this research on kind of social issues with an agenda for social change that might not have necessarily used this. But there's specific themes, and I think this was part of the conversation that we had with the policy panel as well. There are specific themes that are useful for this work. And so one of the questions then is trying to understand, as we think about the recommendations, if we're saying that this might be a useful way or a useful lens for doing this kind of work that we do, what is intersectionality in the global south? And if we are going to be using this then and using those key themes and tenets that we've kind of developed in our various research, when we talk about context, what is the context that we're working on, right? When we talk about oppression, what does oppression look like? And I say this because even when we look at kind of the work and at least the movements in the United States and Europe, some of the focus on intersectionality might be particularly focused on kind of gender or marginalization of women, particular in that context. But we've heard from the various presentations that, we're dealing with contexts that have high rates of informality. We're dealing with contexts where there's kind of conflicts in the region, where there's an ongoing genocide that has implications on public health and, and access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. What do we mean when we kind of use these key tenets within our specific context? And then obviously there's the issue on kind of complexity and comparison. And what does that mean then, again, if we're saying that this is not just a term that is intended to be divisive, but from our various experiences, some workers and communities have been able to develop solidarity by considering, intersectionality in that work, right? So what does this look like from the perspective of the Global South? And then again, on the issue of relationality, where it's not just about the comparing of different contexts, but coming from our experiences in Africa, in Latin America, where do we kind of move forward with that. So there are those questions in terms of thinking about intersectionality. What does that look like? And then recommendations then in terms of how we take this forward. Yes, there's the roles that we were discussing from kind of the international funder side, but there's also, as now this kind of network of researchers and activists that have been brought together through this project on intersectionality, what do we see our way forward, in particular, being the continued work on this from the Global South perspective? That's a big question, so I might give you some time to think about this, but I think it's something that might be useful in carrying this work forward. So, but I guess it wasn't a big question.
And thank you for the big question, Siviwe. Here's my tiny answer. Also, it's quite reflective. I've always said from the beginning we've been intersectional without having to proclaim that we're intersectional. So having to be compelled to identify research as intersectional, the first short answer, we'll sort of like be depriving ourselves of some of our, local discourses and ways of doing research. This doesn't mean to say I'm taking away intersectionality and what it can bring to the table and how it can benefit our research down here in the Global South. But I don't think we should aim to be intersectional for the sake of, trying to seem intersectional or, trying to, this is terrible, but, trying to like attract funding and whatnot. I think it will take away so much material and discourse, like original discourse. I think that'll take away from us down here in the Global South. And I don't know if you mind, Lisa, if I just drop what we were discussing, or is that top secret? It's not top secret, okay. We fear, that if we, go the route of like, doing the whole intersectionality thing to gain grants, it's going to do to the whole research discourse what it did to, development studies or what was it? Feminist gender mainstreaming. So for the sake of originality and staying true to ourselves and trying to grapple with our social issues as best as we can, we incorporate it, but it's not forced. That's the first short answer.
So we've been emboldened by being allowed to give bits of the answer. So thank you. Yeah, maybe another thing is, I was also sort of thinking, the fads that come through in development and gender mainstreaming. Have you gender front-loaded this? And, that type of thing. And we burn ourselves out. But maybe thinking about how it's useful. And the one thing that's come out of this workshop is, without having to adapt or change the way you do something, you just ask the question, what would it add to what I do? And has it captured, I think, all the case studies? Has it captured the lived realities that we need to understand in order to move forward, propose a solution, interrogate policy, type of thing? So, to use some sort of jargon, it's a tool in the toolbox. Don't you hate that? It's what does it add? And it's not so scary when you think about it that way. But I think we're all, including the funders, are aware of how these fads kind of come and inform the way we do things. But yeah, there's a smaller answer, Siviwe, that's two small bits. Who should I pass to? Yeah.
Thanks. I don't know, like for me, okay, let me start with I feel I still stand by. I totally side with the whole thing about gender mainstreaming. It's the same thing with also like doing gender equality, where you also find yourself having to mention in certain parts of your narrative gender equality, so that it just looks like it's inclusive. To moving to more in terms of the action as opposed to the rhetoric. And I think it goes as far as just literally in everything in terms of applying intersectionality even beyond, even like in procurement. I'll use that for example. So when you're having a research team, who are the members of your research team? And is it an intersectional group which represents, you know, all that diversity? Because that's something also we do within our sphere of work, our service providers, for example, etc. In terms of even who does, for example, the graphics of this report, you'll find there was an intersectional approach to who actually ended up contributing to that whole process. But I think also beyond that is also looking in terms of collaborating in terms of different strengths between different institutions. And so you might find that IDRC, together with some few funders who are open-minded in terms of using that approach and letting you use your definition of intersectionality within your work. Because sometimes you find donors who are like, this is how we understand intersectionality, and so this is how you should apply it, without necessarily being open to having that freedom to have that flexible funding which will support the work, but also having strengths between different institutions. So for example, FEMNET is not a research institution. We've never claimed to be one. We do research though, but of course we don't do research from like my academia hat, where we have, you know, a theoretical framework and methodology and all that, because of the different stakeholders we try and target. But you'll find, of course, like institutions like SKIS do that. But then when it comes to the advocacy component, maybe you're standing and you're like, okay, we have this amazing research, so then now what next? And that's where, for example, working in those partnerships with like us at FEMNET, we can be able to, our work is literally to unpack complex information, or information which is considered complex, to reach diverse, you know, demographics. And so then we work through that to be able to make sure we get the mass mobilization. So I think a lot of those components and collaborations is something that can actually be able to advance using an intersectional approach without focusing too much on the work of intersectionality, but always asking ourselves, who are we doing this work for? Even like with the research, for example, that Matt shared on GBV, we do a lot of work also around, of course, economic justice and microeconomic, but a lot of GBV you find is related to also economic violence. Half of the issues, especially in Kenya, because you have a rising case of femicide, it's largely because of household debt. The partner doesn't like that the one is earning more, he beats her up until she dies, something like that. And these are prominent cases. So that already feeds into, I can already see in my head how a sort of research, you know, can be able to collaborate based off of just some of the information he shared. And so I think we need to be able to have more partnerships and collaboration based on different strengths to actually amplify that approach beyond just it as a term.
So I just had a question to all of the people who presented here, whether you actually, when you were formulating your research project, whether you actually used the intersectionality term and framework, whether you actually used that at the inception, or whether it was a sort of a retrospective analysis of what you did. I think that would also be helpful, right, in figuring out for whom intersectionality works, and maybe for others it may not work as well.
Okay, I think I have answers. So the first answer, I think, is in our case, for example, it was, as I mentioned, qualitative, person-centered, participatory action research. But at the end of the day, I feel like back to recommendations, or what we're trying to do, is that I think with the emergence of the Global South as a category of research when it comes to context, it has to do a lot with intersectionality. Like the bottom line definition of intersectionality, which I looked up now just to read, is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, and as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So I feel like the Global South has been emerging as a category and as a context of research because it has its own nuanced forms of oppression, it has its own history, it has its own kind of sensitivities,
yes, they differ across different contexts, but at the end of the day, we came with the approach of Global South to kind of balance the Global North a bit and to not always be under the developing and underdeveloping or to be developed countries, to step out of those frameworks. So I feel like if we are discussing social research that has to do with people from contexts that already adhere to the idea that we share a form of oppression or a history of marginalization of some sort, whatever the context or people we're talking to is, I think intersectionality will barge through the door before we even know it. So I feel like even if we're not calling it intersectionality, if we're not having a methodological framework pinpointing Kimberly Crenshaw and saying this was coined in 1980s by black feminist movements, if we don't have to do all of this, it will end up being intersectional in nature if what we're trying to do is social research on the ground, if what we're trying to do is to amplify voices, if what we're trying to do is to understand power dynamics and advantages and oppression through a lens of social research, I think we'll end up doing intersectionality, not necessarily if we call it so or we don't, but it will end up being intersectional. So I feel like, as it was mentioned throughout the sessions today and yesterday, I think the recommendation can be that intersectionality be understood and read about by I think funders and social researchers and social research centers, so that it kind of clicks with a specific terminology and theoretical framework, so that when it applies to research, we can actually use this tool, or we can actually have grounds for using this tool, because I feel like it pops up anyways. Yeah, I feel like if we're looking at human beings, you will end up having to look at the social categorization they fall under or they were born in. So yeah, I don't think it's an answer. It's an open-ended answer to an open-ended question, but that's what I'm thinking so far.
No, so, yeah, may I, or is there someone else? No. So just to respond, I guess since we're having a discussion, right? So similar to what Hannah was saying yesterday as well, right? That, I mean, if we want to name the histories from which this conversation emerges in the Global South, we can. Like, for instance, feminist movements in the Global South have systematically utilized this kind of framework for a long, long time, right? And maybe it is time that we told the funders to also recognize that there are frameworks that have already been utilized in the Global South that speak to this same kind of thinking, right? And that, you know, validate those as well, right? Given sort of like the epistemic inequality, right, that exists with regards to knowledge production in the Global North, knowledge production in the Global South, right? So enable us to also sort of enter that conversation by validating what has already been done here, right? Without necessarily compelling us to fit our frameworks to that language, right? Which is more available and more familiar and more just out there.
I think for the sake of recommendations, do you have any examples of specific frameworks that can kind of be a mixed method that merges with intersectionality or reflects it in some sort of way that has been on the ground in the Global South but hadn't been as popular or as highlighted?
Yeah, I think maybe the report already has that, because it references the Dalit feminist work in India, for instance, right? Just one example, which we also used in formulating our report, that speaks to both the possibility of including intersectionality as a framework, but also the long history of including multiple contexts and multiple sort of identity positionalities, right? So.
And did you have a response or a question?
Yeah, well, we're not planning to response to this.
Okay. It's a response here. You can go ahead.
Not directly.
Oh, okay.
You have it.
Oh, okay. I think it was Nicole who mentioned kind of this importance, and I think, I mean, it's part of the conversation that we've also been having around the importance of local knowledge, and indigenous knowledge as well. And I think, I mean, in terms of how we have done the work that we do, I think the response from the group has generally been, well, we've had to think about these issues because of our context, because of our colonial histories, anyways. And we might, if we're trying to kind of fashion our frameworks as an alternative to how they're theorized in the Western literature, we might actually find ourselves falling into a trap where we're like, oh, well, maybe this isn't something that has been theorized, or we can't find a particular research paper that talks about what, for instance, Nicole was talking about, the importance of centering people and communities, or batu pele, or, people first, right, in our own context. But we've always had to think about this in this way. So I think there is that question. I mean, it's come out a lot as well. The issue on collaboration in terms of even influencing policies or mass mobilization, but also collaboration in terms of how we actually, develop these ways of doing things based on our context. And I think the different studies that we've been able to put together, even here, suggest different ways of dealing with these issues. And I think another question that I did have, again, to put to you, it came up, I think, with Rudo's intervention in the last session on implementation. I think when we started this workshop, there was this recognition of intersectionality being important in just the general international development discourse, but a recognition that the application and the implementation has been very slow. So we know that these are issues that need to be considered in the research, but it's not actually being applied. And some of that raises issues of accessibility, and also, again, who we collaborate with, whether or not we're developing this research and it goes to a particular advocacy network, or, and I think that's thinking about, how do we deal with the issue of implementation? And one suggestion has been made is to actually make it accessible, not just to the communities that we work with, but to the people that we're hoping will actually apply this in policies. And both a question and a recommendation, I guess. Lisa?
I'm sure that many of us have had experiences working with partners or collaborators or even funders who have not prioritized or even really taken into consideration sort of the multiple issues that are shaping people's lived experiences and all the different systems of power and inequality. And that is a really unpleasant experience to have. My experience of being funded by IDRC was very positive, actually. And to clarify, we did actually publish our research in journals and books, but the support that we got from the IDRC to expand the kind of outputs that we were using for our work, to include outputs that were created by the girls and young women themselves, was fantastic, actually. And that was a really positive experience. And I think including a discussion about, or I don't want to say a requirement, of asking people to think intersectionally when they're conceptualizing their projects in the way that we make decisions methodologically and things like that, is extremely valuable for those people who don't. For people who are already working in this space, using this way of thinking about things and working with people, it can feel, to define it can sometimes feel limiting sometimes. And part of the power of intersectional thinking is that it resists definition in a way. And with its history in feminist, aligned with feminist thinking and feminist thought, and if you think about the Combahee River Collective, there was an activist element in it, as there has been in feminist theorizing, in feminist theory from its inception, where it kind of grew with this idea of a feminist politics and the idea of the importance of disrupting something. I worry about institutionalizing something like intersectionality, because then sometimes the risk is of sanitizing sanitizing that aspect of this way of thinking and working, or the risk of losing that, the part of the work that disrupts, the part of the work that doesn't accept the status quo as it is. And sometimes then in those north-south relationships that can be so problematic, if we're not keeping an eye on that aspect of what intersectional thinking asks us to do as researchers, I don't think there's a problem with keeping an eye on that. I don't think that there's an issue with staying wary of how it's being applied, of how people are understanding it. And if it is going to be institutionalized, keeping an eye on how that is evolving so that it doesn't lose its potential to contribute in a meaningful way to the work that we do, to the people with whom we work. Yeah, and also, if we focus too much on intersectionality, the way that it's been theorized in the global north, which has a lot to offer, of course, we aren't always necessarily paying enough attention to the decolonial or the post-colonial theorizing we should be doing at the same time. And so if you look at feminist post-colonial theory, a lot of that is using the same kind of thinking, but it is very much including this idea of being critical of these global power relations that create the situations in which many of us are working. I don't know if that made sense. It's quite late in the afternoon now. Thank you.
I just want to add, thank you,
that in my case, it is even recently that I got to know the proponent of intersectionality. When actually, at the time of conceptualizing our project proposal, there was no mention of the proponent. But we proposed that we want to understand the intersection between social categories, social identities, and gender as it affects maternal healthcare utilization. So the way our research questions were framed with an intersectional lens, without having to use any framework as a guide. Yes.
I think we're kind of echoing a debate I always have with my anthropology friends, especially my partner, where like, what's so nuanced about intersectionality? If you're doing social research, you will be forced to look at those categories, but it's so shocking that I can come back and say, in development research, this is very nuanced, and this is very niche, and this is very different, and it doesn't work, and funders don't want it, and people want the one-size-fits-all, and we're actually fighting for an intersectional approach because it's the thing that makes more sense. But for example, in ethnographic research, it's kind of not a given, but on some level, it is a given. Like, you will look at this person and how they relate to the family and kinship and money and the system and the state and institutions, and then race and class and how those play a role as well. So I feel like it's a development studies issue that we are trying to push back, and we're kind of talking about normalizing it or mainstreaming it, and I feel like no matter how much we try and critique it, it does not really take away from the benefits it can actually give. So yes, we can critique it. We can say it's a Western concept. We can say it doesn't really apply in the straightforward way. There are many critiques that are also addressed in the synthesis report, but I feel like it gives much more than it takes, because if you want to study humans, and what we're telling you is please look at their social lives as well, like, yeah, why not? So yeah, I feel like I just remember so many conversations about like, why do you call yourself an intersectional feminist while you're an anthropologist, so by default you're doing intersectionality and looking for equality? Like, not really. Not all people think this way.
I just want to say yes, 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 and thank you. Because I mean, the only thing that because I keep searching, right? And I think that the last statement is really what sticks for me, that it gives more than it takes. And I think that's in everything I'm thinking about, that's where I land, because when we are doing something, there are things that are readily accessible to us. So when I look at someone based on what I already know and understand of the world, they are the things that immediately come to mind. And inevitably, when we do research, the things we're already conscious of feed into the process. But what intersectionality and feminism demand is that outside of what you automatically recognize, what might you be missing? Where are the blind spots? And for me, that's what intersectionality pushes us to do. It's saying there are things we naturally recognize because of our experiences and exposure. But so often, because we don't know this, you don't know it, you are new, you are in a context, right? And so what are the things that might be missed if we don't pause to be intentional? And that's what it's demanding. In my mind, that's what it demands of us. And that's what we can't afford to risk losing, whatever we call it, whether we call it something. But there's that critical thing that says, outside of what I know, what might I be missing? You know, and it's taking that pause.
I still have to respect you, Chair. So I think building on Suhaila and Rudo's comments, I wonder, actually when Suhaila was speaking, the first question that came to my mind was that, well, is this an issue or a question for us, or is this an issue for development in general, right? And what might, I guess, the decolonial opportunities of intersectionality bring in this kind of international development space? So we acknowledge that, you know, this is the work that we're doing, but even in this context, and you know, where we've been discussing these projects, the whole thing is about, you know, how do we apply intersectionality in research? And that usually starts from, you know, we talk about throughout the research process, and we talk about the research design, but given our own context, and also in the work that we do, working with international organizations, I think there might be an important role, and I think this is the work that we've done here, you know, is something that I do, and I appreciate the colleagues from IDRC who have actually engaged with this work, because I think the question then goes back to organizations like the IDRC is, while we've been having these conversations, what does this mean for our work? How do we actually engage and collaborate with these organizations in these contexts in an intersectional way? And that means being intersectional before the research design. At the point in which we are thinking about or developing the research agenda or the research programs, what are the actual issues, if we're talking about context, and we're talking about the particular challenges within these contexts that we're working on, what are the important issues that communities are having to deal with, and that can be supported through this development work that we're working on. And I say this because having worked now for several years in this international space, I know that the agenda shifts constantly. So when we were dealing with the COVID pandemic, a lot of the funding was around COVID. And now we're talking about climate change. There's a lot of funding around, you know, climate and just transition. And we've recognized the kind of micro level impacts of all these big macro issues. but at the same time, communities on the ground experience these issues in very specific and unique ways. So we might care about tax justice, and we might care about care and social reproduction, for instance. And I'm saying this because I was just in Ghana, where people are still, women, market traders are still saying, actually, we want money. We can do with money. We need access to credit. But we know that the development space has moved on to that because we're saying that this is not the solution, this is our focus now. So how do we not lose sight of the challenges, the everyday challenges that communities are experiencing, and what they are saying we need to kind of do more work on. And so I think, yeah, there's a question about what is the kind of research agenda, how is it developed, before we get into the intersectionality of the research design and the process, et cetera. And I do think that there might be, particular to Lisa's comment, decolonial opportunities in intersectionality in that sense, given the history of development in general, which I'm sure you guys are aware of. Thanks.
So I may not be understanding everything that was said, but so Sohaila, are you saying that within sort of the framework of development research, right, that it is a question that or the intersectionality framework provides for necessary questions, right? And not necessarily within a sort of a global South research framework where these questions are, seem inevitable in some sense. Is that vaguely a little bit of what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. So interesting for me, but also really interesting to think about the fact that, even before we talk about sort of using, like Sibi said, an intersectional framework for our research, that we need to ask these larger questions of, what is getting funded and what are we allowed to research, right? What are we allowed to think about and what are we permitted to address, right? I mean, these are sort of more fundamental questions that we need to have also some ability to critique, right? And I don't know if this intellectual framework is necessarily thinking about critique from that level, right? I mean, I appreciated that the conversation that we had earlier about funding, at which I took the liberty of saying certain things at this level. But I'm just like thinking, the way in which critique and politics and sort of like inclusion and all of that are being talked about is not uniform, right? It's being talked about at the level of us doing work in our communities, but it's not being talked about at the global level of how funding priorities are decided and all of that, to which we don't really have that much say in. So we just flirting and coping, that's all.
This is really interesting. So wait, what I wanted to add on was like when Fahana was mentioning some of the frameworks which also like contribute to intersectionality outside of, like, of course, Kimberly Crenshaw. I was thinking around Sylvia Tamale, who's also like a post-colonial African feminist, and and she really advocates for like an Afrofeminist praxis, which has post-colonial like feminist theories, which contribute to transnationality and collective like approaches, which would automatically apply intersectionality without having to use the term intersectionality. But I think what I was also thinking at the back was that I think also we might not necessarily be, I don't know if it's we're not giving ourselves enough grace or open to like concepts change, concepts develop. Like why intersectionality as we knew it 5 years back has of course changed and developed over the years. And I'm pretty sure in the next 2 years it will have also evolved. So I think we should also give ourselves that sort of space for the evolution of intersectionality, like there are many ways to skin a cat. And so then that would allow different perspectives to contribute into the original notion of intersectionality, but still consider the differences. Because I also think around, especially when you do work around multiple discrimination that happens around, for example, the same gender, or even the same race. And I'll give the example of migrant domestic workers. You know, it's women who come from a specific race who are discrimination on women from, you know, the global south as well, but from different dimensions. And of course, when you have historical context of, for example, Arab slave trade and its contribution to Gulf countries and why they treat, you know, migrant domestic workers in a certain way, that's in itself a form of, maybe I use the term loosely, like intersectionality, which is something which is even further multiple discrimination within certain dynamics which are similar. But then I wouldn't necessarily consider that it's not intersectionality. I just think there's a different layer, which I feel like we should also like just give ourselves that avenue of evolution, so that it's not that these are the foundations. We respect the introduction by Kimberly Crenshaw for giving us that lens. However, it's different depending on different demographic, and it's okay. Yeah.
I completely agree, but I think like I don't know why we're trying to like get the coin term and feel like we're dragging it so far that it loses its meaning, right? So if intersectionality, as far as I can understand, means looking at social categories being gender, race, class, ethnicity, social kind of resources, all of those social categorizations, to adopt those and look at them and analyze them during research, then I think that would also apply as class. Yani in Egypt, we have a huge class disparity also of house workers who are Egyptian, working with and for Egyptian women who face discrimination by the same women, although there is no race there per se, but there's class and it's very prominent and it's there. So I don't know why it needs to be exclusive to a specific form of race or a specific form of gender or a specific form of kind of context, as we have been saying so far. But what I feel like it should be, I feel like it just should be like a mind map. Like before you're conceptualizing anything, you visualize what are the facets I'm trying to look at. And those facets will always have those social categories. We call it intersectionality, call it person-centered, call it ethnographic, call it whatever, sociological. All of the frameworks will end up necessitating that you kind of have this mind map before starting as a researcher, not funded, not thinking in titles, not anything. I want to look at this. And then whatever this category is, you need to flesh it out a bit. And by fleshing it out, you'll have social categories. So if what intersectionality does is that it kind of provides us with forcing us and pressuring us into accounting for them, then that's what I'm advocating for. But if it takes away from those, then there's no point, really. So that's what I feel. I don't feel like we are exclusivists when it comes to intersectionality, and that's we're recreating the one-size-fits-all, if that's what we're trying to say. But as I said, I feel like in doing social research, it pushes us, as mentioned, to fill those gaps. That if you thought you would do this and not look at race or class or the demographic area even, and the history of this demographic area and how they deal with people there and how they deal with women there or men there or children there, you end up missing a lot of the nuance and a lot of the flesh on the bone, like I mentioned yesterday. So yeah, I don't want us to be completely intersectional, but it's a cool tool in the toolbox.
And I think that's a perfect way to close off this session. Thank you all for participating in this workshop. And I really thought, one of the main aims of this was to actually try and get a robust discussion on these issues, and to not just speak about them in only kind of these theoretical ways, when the work that we deal with is very real and affects the communities that we work with. And I think that speaks true to even the idea of this concept being focused around social change. And if we're actually wanting to achieve that, I think being specific about how we apply these various frameworks in the work that we do is very important. And I've noted a few kind of recommendations based on this discussion. One of them being, at least the main one, is around not imposing frameworks or language when we do this work, and a particular interest in, I think, and again, true to the theories as well, being more focused around representing social issues as they are experienced by the communities in the context that we work in. There's suggestions around, okay, well, this is an additional way of doing things, right? The tool in the toolbox way, and thinking more about what does it add. And I think we touched on this as well in the synthesis report on what is the actual value of using this concept and an intersectional lens in the work that we do. I think it was also mentioned that there are issues of application and implementation, but we do need to focus more towards action. And I believe Nicole mentioned this as well, moving more towards an action instead of rhetoric, right? So we have these academic discussions around what this means, but actually, what does it mean to actually apply it? And a lot of the case studies did this in retrospect. But I think going forward, understanding the value of intersectionality, I think there's a particular questions have been raised around, okay, how do we actually do this? There's been a lot of conversation around collaborating with different organizations to try and actually do the work that we do. And I think for those of us who work in academia, but also at the same time, Ruth is in the room, so I'm going to speak to you. There is this intention of wanting to influence policy, and I mentioned at the SCIS, we're constantly thinking about what does that mean. But there are specific suggestions here about the kinds of collaborations that might help us to do that, given limitations, in terms of where we might, individually be located or our organizations be located. I think there's a lot of questions, and this came out in the synthesis report, around the flexibility of funding as well, and how that is important to enable us to do the work that we do, but also thinking about intersectionality in development research as beyond just the kind of the research project, but what that actually means for international funding, research funding organizations or development organizations in general, and where intersectionality can be incorporated in thinking about questions beyond just the project and the actual agenda and what gets funded. I think there's a lot on partnerships, and I do encourage everyone that has participated in this workshop to engage beyond this. I think people have started making connections with each other in terms of the work that we do, and I think we can continue this conversation forward in trying to do the very important work that we all are doing in our spaces. So once again, I want to thank you all for participating in the workshop. We were very fortunate and honored to have our case study authors, some of them in the room with us. We know, Prof. Hanifa from Sri Lanka with us, Sohaila traveled from Egypt to be with us. We know Matt came from the Gambia. We also had a lot of our case study authors who joined online, Kanchan, Srajana, Maren also presented yesterday, and also to thank our colleagues across sectors who joined from advocacy networks, our colleagues who are kind of practitioners or in the policy-making space, and academics as well, who added, I think, to the robust discussions that we've had and gave us a lot about, what to think about. If we're saying, as I mentioned at the start of this event, if we're not just doing research for research's sake, how do we actually move forward with that research? What do we do once we've kind of developed all of these studies to actually influence social change and change the world. Thank you also to Samantha Nasrallah, who joined from the IDRC to be here, our speakers from the IDRC, and our funders who also presented at this event, and also Ivan has left, but also thank you to our colleagues also who joined from the Colombian embassy. I'm looking forward to future engagement and work with you, and feel free to reach out to us with further collaboration and partnerships as was recommended in the session. Thank you.